So in this lesson, we're going to look at the fractional reserve banking. It's how our banking system within the United States works, and based on the Federal Reserve, of course, controlling the system and how all of this lays out. So let's begin with the banks and the money supply. So banks can influence the money supply through their influence on the quantity of demand deposits. So remember, this is the checking account, the M2 are the savings accounts. So think of the bank as simply a depository institution. This is just where the money goes. That's all it's doing, is you're putting it in there. So its only purpose is to store people's money until they need it. So when you think about a bank, as that's its purpose, you are storing your money there until you need it. And in order to do that, the bank is going to give you an incentive of the interest rates in order to store your money. So that's what a checking or savings account is anyway, really. It's just a place for you to store your money and you get it when you need it. So the bank holds your money until you demand it, thus the term demand deposits. Say, but not all money that is deposited is given out. Some is left in reserve. So the reserves are deposits that the banks have received but not loaned out. So remember now that the Federal Reserve has these reserve requirements. It says there's a minimum amount that you have to hold. So if the bank gives out no loans, then 100% of the reserves are held in the bank. And this can best be expressed in what we call a T account. And it's an accounting statement. So if you take the assets and the liabilities, which is the amount owed. So the reserves are $100, and the liabilities are $100. So the bank had a deposit of $100. That's the deposit. So the bank had a deposit of $100. So if the bank holds 100% of the reserves, it has no effect on the money supply. You'll notice the reserves equal the liabilities. Banks, however, are not required to hold 100% of the reserves, though. Instead, the Federal Reserve sets a reserve requirement, which is the minimum amount of reserves a bank has to keep on hand. So the bank can hold excess reserves. They can choose to hold above the reserve requirement, but they have to at least hold the reserve requirement. And these funds are called excess reserves. So here's an example of what happened when the bank holds on to only a fraction of its reserves. So if we use a reserve requirement of 10%, so the bank must always have 10% of its deposits, of its assets, in the bank at all times. So when we look at the way it breaks down, so the $100 is deposited into a bank. And so that means that the reserves are $10 and the bank can loan out $90. So that's what we're really saying here. So the total assets for the bank are $100 because that's what it's going to owe at all times. So the bank owes $100 based on that deposit. It's loaned out 90 of those dollars and it's kept 10 in reserve based on what the Fed has told them. So 10% of the deposit is held in reserve while 90% of the deposit is loaned out. Now the bank still has to pay the $100 in deposits, but at the same time it generated an extra $90 into the economy. So if you look at the money supply, that person deposited $100. They still have it. Now they've loaned out $90. So now there's $190 in the money supply. That's how banks can generate inflation within the economy. So the money supply went from $100 to $190 because of the requirement that bank only hold a fraction of its reserves. Now, so as that reserve requirement increases, you'll notice, of course, the amount of money in the money supply will decrease. If it's 50%, if it's 60, if it's 70, then the amount of money that has to be held in reserves increases while the amount of loanable money goes down. So the effect of fractional reserve banking does not stop with just one loan, though. That money was loaned out and eventually ends up in another bank. All money's going to end up in the bank somewhere eventually. So when we look at it, this is our first bank. So this is what we just did. And then we can look over here at the second location. And so now what we're seeing is there's a deposit of $90. So the $90 in loans becomes a deposit of $90 in our second bank. So remember that 10% reserve requirement. So the reserves is $9 while loans become $81 and the assets are $90. So we had that 190 there. Well, that 190 has now become 190 plus 81 because of how this works out. So if you run this through all multiple banks and so how it could occur, you end up looking at this. So here's our original deposit of $100. The first bank loan goes to 90. The second bank is 81. The third is 72.90. And then we have a fourth, a fifth, and a sixth, and so on. As a result, the total money supply becomes $1,000. So $100 deposited with a 10% reserve requirement creates $1,000 in the economy. So the original $100 generated an extra 900 in the money supply. So you can see what happens here. So that reserve requirement becomes extremely important in determining how much money actually ends up in the money supply. So you can look at it here again. So $1,000 deposit, you'll notice 900 to loan, 100 to reserve. So we have the spending 900, and then you just keep going and going and going. So you'll notice that at this point there's $1,900 in the system. The bank has 100. At this point there's $2,710 in the system, and the bank has 190. And then at this point there's $3,493 in the system, and the bank has 271 as we go through this process. So that's how fractional reserve banking works out. You can take that money amount, and you know that reserve requirement, and you can start figuring out real quick with a money multiplier how much money that's going to generate. So how does the Fed figure into this reserve banking? Well, we know they set the reserve requirement. And their control of the money supply is not precise, though, because they have two problems that arise due to fractional reserve banking. One is that the Fed doesn't control the amount of money that households choose to hold as deposits. So that money, that differs. Now, one of the things, of course, is the interest rates does influence that, but it's not as if people have to deposit money in banks. The second is the Fed doesn't control the amount of money that bankers choose to lend. The fact is, banks can hold excess reserves. So even though the reserve requirement would be 60%, maybe they're holding 70% in. So it's hard for them to get a precise amount of how much money is actually in the economy and how to regulate it very, very carefully. So it's not precise in terms of how they control it.